Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be with you all today. As Ashley said, my name is Claire, and I'm a counselor at Genesis Women's Shelter and Support, and I work at our outreach office. So we also have a shelter, and we have a second outreach office that just opened in South Dallas, but we're located in the Oak Lawn area of Dallas. And so we see women and children who have experienced domestic violence within the Dallas area, or kind of our radius is within an hour of our outreach office. And so today we're going to be talking about Domestic Violence 101, and we're going to be doing a brief, not brief, but we're going to be doing a more surface level education on what is domestic violence. We're going to be defining abuse. We're going to be talking about the different forms of domestic violence. We're going to talk about some common trends that happen in domestic violence relationships. We're going to be talking about why she stays, why does he do that, and then also how you can be a support for victims who have experienced domestic violence, resources that might be available, and the services that we offer here at Genesis. But as Ashley said, I would love to hear your questions throughout. And so if you want to put those in the chat, and then also there are going to be times that I'm going to ask for some participation, and if you can answer in the chat for that as well. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. And then, perfect. So hopefully you all can see my screen, but we're going to be talking about the dynamics of domestic violence, or Domestic Violence 101, as this course is called. So what is domestic violence? And so I want to start off talking to you about some of the language that I'm going to use during this presentation. And so during this presentation, you're going to hear me oftentimes, or almost every time, referring to the survivor of domestic violence as she and the abusive person as he. And some of the reasons that I'm doing that is because research shows that women are more likely to be the survivor or the victim of domestic violence, and the male is going to be the abusive person in the relationship. At Genesis, we only see women and children, so we are only working with the women. And so that is why you're hearing me say she. But do not hear me say at all that men cannot experience domestic violence, or that domestic violence can't happen in same-gendered relationships. We definitely know that that is true for both, that men can experience domestic violence, and that domestic violence can be present in same-gender relationships, in either same female relationships or same male relationships. So I'm just going to use he for the abuser and she for the survivor, just to keep it more uniform throughout the presentation. And you're also going to hear me use the term abuser a lot. And so when I'm using that term, I'm talking about anyone who is exhibiting any kind of abusive behavior. And as I mentioned, we're going to get more into what is abusive behavior in this presentation, but know that you'll hear me say that as well throughout this presentation. So what is domestic violence? We're going to start off by defining it. So I have a couple of definitions here on the slide that I want to go over. But the first definition is that domestic violence occurs when one person in an intimate partner relationship exercises power and control over the other through a pattern of intentional behaviors. And so I want to take a moment dissecting this definition, and I want to focus on these words, power and control. And so I'm going to use an example that one of my coworkers has used in the past that I find very relatable. But she talks about this power and control in a relationship by using the example that you're hanging out with your sister, and I relate to this because I have a sister who is a year younger than me. We're the same size, have the same similar fashions, and we're hanging out, and I see that my sister has one of my shirts that she borrowed without asking. And in the heat of the moment, I get really annoyed and I call her the B word. Now, my sister and I have a pattern of a safe relationship. There hasn't been any previous physical violence. There has been trust within the relationship, and there has been a pattern of safety in the relationship. So when I call my sister the B word, how do you think she's going to feel? And this is a time to put in the chat too. She might be feeling sad or confused. She might be feeling defensive, mad, hurt. Yeah. Shocked and confused. Yeah. These are really good feelings that she might be feeling. And I agree with all of them. She probably is feeling a little mad that I called her that, or feeling really defensive. She might be hurt because calling someone the B word is an unhealthy behavior within a relationship. But do you think that she's feeling intimidated? Do you think she's feeling scared of me when I call her that? What do y'all think? Yeah, no, she's probably not, because we have had that pattern of trust and safety within our relationship. So she might be feeling all of those hurt feelings, but she's probably not feeling intimidated me because I don't act that way. But let's flip the example. Let's say that I am driving with my husband in the car, and my husband is a big guy. He has a big presence too. He's got one of those big personalities, and he has a large, loud voice. And so you take notice when he's talking. And so we're driving down the road, and him and I get into an argument. And things start to get a little bit more heated, and he calls me the B word. How do you, and there has not always been a pattern of safety or trust in our relationship. Maybe he has exhibited some of those behaviors in the past, or he's called me names in the past, or maybe there has been times when I have felt scared. And so in that moment, when we're driving and we're arguing and he calls me the B word, how do you think I'm feeling? Scared? Anxious? Yeah. I think those are really offended. Yeah. I think those are really good examples. So in that moment, I might be feeling really angry too. So I noticed that my husband, who again is bigger than me, who there's not always been a pattern of safety, we get in an argument and he calls me the B word. My first reaction might be like, ooh, things are getting too tense. Let me see if there's something I can do to help calm this down. And by calming this down, I might be saying, oh, no, you're right. Or let's just talk about this later. Or I'm sorry, I really didn't mean for this to happen. And I start changing my behaviors, and I start changing what I'm saying in order to keep him from getting more escalated. Because in that moment, I am feeling intimidated by him. And so the difference between those situations with my sister and with my husband is that I changed my behaviors in order to try to keep the situation from escalating, in order from trying to keep my husband from getting more angry and trying to calm things down. So that is where the control piece comes in a domestic violence relationship. So again, there can definitely be unhealthy patterns or unhealthy behaviors in a relationship, but when it becomes abuse is when those unhealthy behaviors are used to have control over the other person. And so when my husband escalates and he calls me the B word, he suddenly has power over me, which causes me to change my behavior. And then he has control because he's getting me to say what I want him to say, which is, or he's getting me to say what he wants me to say, which is like, I'm sorry, you're right. Let's not talk about it anymore because I'm changing my behaviors, even though I might not want to, but I'm doing because I want that safety. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to go over the second part too, over the pattern of intentional behaviors. So what do we know about patterns? Patterns repeat themselves. So if you're looking at like a checkered board or a checkered picture, you know it's going to go black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white. There's a pattern. So what happens in an abusive relationship or with domestic violence too, is there a pattern of those behaviors? There's a pattern of that verbal abuse, of that emotional abuse, of that physical abuse, and it's intentional. And so they're intentionally raising their voice. They're intentionally calling you a name. They're intentionally using their body to intimidate you in order to gain that power and control. So I always want to point out that that is what defines an abusive relationship, is that power and control piece of it, and also that pattern of intentional behavior. And so I briefly want to look at this. Domestic violence is a systematic diminishment of a woman in her home. And so I want to focus on that systematic diminishment for a second. So that systematic, what are systems? Systems are what helps us get from point A to point B. They're what helps us get what we want. And so systematics and systems are patterns as well. And so we just talked about patterns, and I want to focus on this diminishment. And so I don't want you to think of diminishment like a wrecking ball coming and just taking down a building, but diminishment that happens piece by piece or brick by brick. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in this slide, how that can look in an abusive relationship. But the diminishment happens over time. And so it doesn't happen all at once, but it escalates over time, or it causes the woman's self-esteem to lower and lower and lower over time, where there is a diminishment of her and the diminishment of her worth and of herself. So that is the definition of domestic violence that we're going to be looking at and referring back to throughout this presentation. So always want to touch on some domestic violence statistics as well, because these are so important to go over, because as you'll see through these statistics, domestic violence is very prevalent. 1 in 4 women in the US will know domestic violence during her lifetime, and it'll be 1 in 3 worldwide. It's also important to note that in the state of Texas, it's 1 in 3. So in the state of Texas, 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence. And that's a huge number. That means that over 30% of our population, of our women, have experienced domestic violence in our lifetime. 1 in 3 teenage girls will be physically assaulted by a boyfriend. So we also have this presentation that we'll do for teen dating violence, but teen dating violence and domestic violence are the same thing. They have the same trends, they have the same behaviors, but we refer to it as teen dating violence because domestic violence usually refers to 2 people living in the home or having that domesticated relationship. But with teens, they're not usually living together. It's usually happening outside of the home. But 1 in 3 teenage girls will be physically assaulted. And so also the age range of women and teens who will experience domestic violence the most is between the ages of 16 and 24. And so that is the age range that domestic violence can be most prevalent and also the most severe. The most severe domestic violence against a woman will happen between the ages of 16 and 24. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 and 44, more than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. And so I'm so glad that y'all are here today so that we can continue to gain education about this issue that affects 1 in 3 women in Texas. Probably people that we've interacted with, clients that we have, community members. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. So going into the types of violence. So today we're going to focus on verbal and emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And so over the next few slides, we're going to be talking more about different examples of each of these types of abuse. But these are 4 of the most common types of abuse that you will see in women. And we'll also talk about financial and spiritual abuse, which are 2 other really big types of abuse that women will experience. Okay. Oh, I hope you didn't look too much at that because I did want to ask, when you think of verbal and emotional abuse, what do you think of? What are some examples that come to mind when you think of verbal and emotional abuse? Because that's what we're going to talk about first. Yeah. Jessica said telling someone they will never find anyone who loves them. Yelling or threats. Yep. Belittling, devaluing. Yep. Those are really good ones. And you're going to see them on our list. So I want to touch on some of these verbal and emotional abuse, but I want to point out that we definitely have the constant criticism, the put down, the name calling, the yelling, the cursing, the rage, the belittling or the devaluing, the denying, minimizing, or blaming the situation, or blaming the abuse, or minimizing or denying the abuse that's actually happened, or blaming her or blaming something else for the abusive behavior. But the first one I want to talk about, which is a big one, and one that a lot of our clients, if not all, report experiencing, is isolation. And so this isolation can look like isolation from resources, and it can also look like isolation from other people. So it might be isolation from being able to have a job, being able to participate in one's faith community, being unable to have a car, being able to exercise any kind of freedom. And it can also be that isolation from other people. So it can be that isolation from family members, isolation from family and friends, isolation from any kind of support, so that her only support is him. So isolation is a really big one, and a really big form of abuse. I also want to talk about how in that constant criticism, those put downs, that name calling that y'all mentioned in the chat, the belittling, devaluing, is that diminishment of her as a woman. So having that constant criticism, having those put downs, those name callings happen constantly, is constantly diminishing her self-worth, constantly diminishing her self-esteem. And so that is that form of abuse that causes her to lose who she is as a person. Down here we have want to also touch on the spreading rumors or telling secrets, or the hot and button issues, because I think it can be really relatable when you're in a romantic relationship, or you're in a intimate relationship with someone. You're going to be sharing personal things. That's something that can bring you closer. You want to share your fears. You want to share your hurts from the past. But it becomes abusive when the person is using those intimate details against you. Maybe they're telling friends and family like some of your most personal feelings, or maybe they're threatening to, like, oh, well, I could just tell them that blah, blah, blah. And so they're using that as a tool against you as a form of power and control. The look. So I know we have the look in parentheses, but that is one I get asked about a lot. And that could be being at a party with someone or being at a party with your partner, and they just give you a look across the room and you immediately know trouble's going to happen at home. Maybe he's giving you a look because he doesn't like who you're talking to, or he thinks you're standing too close to someone else, or maybe you've been talking to that person too long, but that look is used as a form of intimidation, which is emotional abuse. Gaslighting. We could have a whole presentation on gaslighting and crazy making. So gaslighting is that form of manipulation that a person will use in order to make the other person feel crazy. We also call it crazy making. And so it could be used, gaslighting could be like denying that it even happened. One of my other coworkers used an example of, say you're in a relationship with someone and you're looking at colors and you're looking at the color yellow and your partner's like, no, that's blue. And you're like, no, it's yellow. I know it's yellow. And they're like, it's blue, it's blue, it's blue, it's blue, it's blue. They're so adamant that it is blue, and they won't let up, that you're finally like, okay, fine, it's blue. And you tell them like it's blue just because you want them to stop. And so that's like the first step, is getting you to agree with them just so they'll stop. And then they continue on and say, it's blue, it's blue, it's blue, it's blue, that you're finally like, is it blue? Maybe I've been wrong this whole time. Maybe it is blue. Am I seeing green right? Am I seeing red right? And it makes you begin to question everything, because they're so persistent about what that happened. And so gaslighting, I think has become a more common term within our society and in our community. And it can be really damaging to a woman, because it begins to make her question her own reality. And then I also want to talk about financial and spiritual abuse real fast. And so financial abuse is what happens whenever the person is controlling finances. Maybe they're not allowing you to have a job, or maybe they're making you have like 2 jobs and you're the sole breadwinner. Maybe they're only giving you money if you perform a certain act for them, or do certain things. And so 99% of women who experience some form of verbal, emotional, physical, sexual abuse also report experiencing financial abuse. So financial abuse is a huge form of abuse in a relationship, in an abusive relationship. And then also spiritual abuse. And so spiritual abuse is one I get a lot of questions about as well. And spiritual abuse can look a couple of different ways. Maybe it is him or the abusive person keeping you from practicing your religion. And so they'll let you go to church, but only if you bring all 5 children with them. And so then you're unable to concentrate on what is going on in the sermon, because you're having to care for the children. Or maybe it's through prayer or whatever spiritual practice belief you do, they're constantly saying, God's not real. Why are you praying to someone who's not real? Or maybe it's using the Bible, scripture, and legalizing it by saying, the woman's supposed to please the man. And since the woman's supposed to please the man, you need to do X, Y, and Z for me. And so, and if you don't, you're going to hell. And so constantly using hell as a way to intimidate her and to use power and control over her. Any questions about any of those? Okay. There will be time for questions at the end too. So if I'm going too fast for anything or you have any questions, know that I'm going to allow some time at the end. But it is a lot of information, and I want to make sure that we get through as much as we can too, so that you have this when you're working with clients and things like that. Okay, so physical abuse. So physical abuse, I think, is when people think of abuse in relationship, they only think of the physical abuse. But I want to point out that physical abuse can look a couple of different ways too. I think the most common way that it can be looked at is through those physical acts, that pushing, shoving, kicking, grabbing, holding, hair pulling, punching, all that, strangulation. So I want to point out strangulation for a second too as a form of physical abuse. And so strangulation is when they are using their hands to cut off around your neck, to cut off your airway. And we always want to ask about strangulation because it can be one of the biggest indicators that more severe could be down the road. And when I say more severe, I mean that there could be murder, or there could be death, or there could be homicide. And so strangulation, I think that the statistic is that if a woman has experienced strangulation, they're 11 times more likely to be killed. And so asking that question can be a really helpful tool for us. And so we always want to ask that. And sometimes women will report that they've experienced strangulation several times in their relationship, but we don't know if we don't ask. And so I also want to talk about how, again, that physical abuse can look like the, hitting, punching, but it can also look like them using their body against you by trapping someone in a room or a car or blocking a doorway with their body. That is a form of physical abuse. It can also be breaking objects, so them damaging their partner's personal property, or throwing or smashing things. Those are also forms of physical abuse. And so that physical abuse, especially when they're throwing and they're breaking items, they might be throwing them really close to your head, or they might be doing it just really close to your body. And it's as a form for them to say, next time I could throw it at your head, next time it could hit you. Or sometimes maybe if they're using strangulation on your throat, but they're not fully cutting off your airway, but you can tell that there's pressure. It's form of physical abuse to say, next time I could do it. And so those are forms of physical abuse that can be used as power and control or power and control as well. And so it is important to note that sometimes it might be that intimidation where they're throwing it next to you, or they're doing it sort of, but not fully. But even that can be a threat that next time I could do it. Okay. Next one is sexual abuse. So here are a bunch of examples of what sexual abuse is. And so sexual abuse can definitely look like that rape or that forced sex. And in the past, that rape or forced sex was not considered illegal. And I think even now, present day, I can't remember all the laws and but it used to be legal. It might still be that it's not considered a felony for a man to rape their wife or to force sex because they were in a marriage. But that is definitely a form of sexual abuse. I want to talk about sexual coercion too. Sexual coercion is something that we see a lot with our clients, and something that our clients a lot of times don't even recognize was a form of abuse within their relationship until they understand some more education behind it. And so sexual coercion is when the abusive partner is intimidating their partner into having sex. Maybe it's that he won't give her money for groceries unless she does sexual acts for them. There's an example that one of my clients, like her children were acting up or being loud, and she knew that her husband was starting to get more and more angry and starting to get more and more escalated. And so she had sex with him, and so that he wouldn't go and hurt the kid. And so that is a form of sexual coercion, because she had to change her behaviors, and she had to change, what she was doing in order to keep him from escalating. So he had power and control over her in that moment. Reproductive coercion too, that could be whenever the abusive person is not allowing the woman to use birth control. It could also be not allowing her to get an abortion. It could also be not allowing or forcing her to have an abortion, or forcing her to use birth control when she doesn't want to. So it's whenever she doesn't have the say of what is happening regarding her reproductive rights. And what we know about abusive relationships too is that it can be even harder for a woman to leave when there are children present, and especially more and more children. And so that can be a way for him to have children with her, that he's making her stay, because she has more to think about. She has more that she has to take into consideration if she's thinking about leaving. And it makes her more dependent on him as well. And then some of the others, that can be is forcing a threesome, forcing someone to watch sex between others, or pornography, sex that hurts, controlling dress, or even withholding sex. So going into how violence escalates. And so I know I mentioned this over in the very beginning too, when we were talking about diminishment, but diminishment is something that happens over time. It's that breaking down, at a slow, steady pace. And so when we talk about violence escalating, we're talking about what it can look like in the relationship. So these are just some examples of what the spectrum of violence can look like. So I think that it can be really common for society and community members, when they think of domestic violence, to only think about that physical violence. But by talking to clients and what our clients report, very rarely will a client report that, oh, my husband just hit me out of nowhere. I have no idea. There was no previous behavior that happened before this. I don't know what came over him. He just hit me. But then we start talking more about the relationship, and she'll be like, oh, actually he does use, he calls me names all the time. Or actually he has been criticizing my appearance a lot more recently. He is yelling a lot more. He's using profanities or put downs. And so this violence will escalate over time. And this is an abuse tactic that abusers will use, because, if you go on a date with someone and they hit you across the face, do you think you're going to go on a second date with them? Probably not. It's probably going to end there. But if you go on a first date with someone and you put on your favorite dress and you do your hair and you do your makeup and you're really excited, and the person is really sweet and really kind, but then he said something like, that's an interesting dress, you might think, oh, well, he knows my dress. Like, okay, that was kind of a weird comment, but whatever. Like, I had a good enough time. So you go on a second date with him and he's like, and everything seems to be going good. Maybe he is still being like really kind. He's showing you a lot of attention, but then he makes a comment and is like, why'd you wear your hair like that? She'll be like, okay, noted. Like, he doesn't really like my hair like this, but that's okay. Like, I'm still having a good time with him. And then on the fifth date, you're wearing some shoes that make it difficult for you to walk to the movies. And he's like, starts saying like, why on earth would you wear those shoes? And then maybe there is an act of physical. Maybe he grabs your arm too aggressively, or maybe there is a hit. And you think, okay, like that's weird. Like this is like, I don't really know what's going on. And so that can be an example of how that abuse can look like when it escalates over time. It usually looks kind of small and you might just pass it away or push it away because you're like, oh, well, this isn't a common behavior, or like, this is weird. But then it happens again and again and again, and you don't realize what's going on until there is that shoving, that slapping, that biting, banging head against the wall, strangulation. So those more extreme forms. And even then you might think, he's okay, like when he's calm, he's okay when he's calm. But this violence does escalate over time. So I want to talk about the cycle of violence as well. So the cycle of violence is something that is really commonly experienced within our clients at Genesis. All of them, most of them, if not all, report experiencing the cycle of violence. So the cycle of violence, usually a relationship starts off in that honeymoon phase. It starts off in that love bubble phase where everything's going good. It might feel like a fairy tale or a romantic comedy, and it's just going really smoothly. There's probably a lot of gifts involved, a lot of fun dates. Everything seems to be going really well, and it might get really intense really quick until tension starts to build. So in this tension building phase, it can look like creating tension or anger, fighting, becoming more critical, irritable, or temperamental, or the abuser punishes you for your mistakes. And in this tension building phase too, a lot of times our clients will report like, I don't really know what's going on. It can feel like walking on eggshells around the person, just worried that at any moment you might set them off. You can just tell that the energy is different. It's like that saying that you can cut the tension with a knife. And so that might go on for a period of time until there is a violent episode. And that violent episode can look like physically, sexually, emotionally, or verbally abusive, flying into a rage easily, hitting, slapping, strangulation, or even using weapons. It might be them just yelling over and over and over and berating, or really just like breaking objects, or that just really violent behavior. So there's going to be that explosive episode, and then it'll go back to the honeymoon phase. And we also like to call this honeymoon phase the manipulative kindness phase. So in this manipulative kindness phase, he might be apologizing. I'm so sorry that happened. I promise I'm going to change. Let's go to couples counseling. Let's go to anger management. I'll do whatever I can just not to lose you. I don't want to lose you. And so there might be a time where you actually do see them changing, or the client might see him changing, and there's hope there. And slowly, though, over time, that tension starts to build again until there is another violent episode. And something that a lot of our clients report too is that this cycle of violence shortens over time. So maybe there's not even a honeymoon phase anymore. There's just a time when he's not being physically violent, but there is still that verbal, emotional, or that the violent episodes are happening more and more frequently. And so it can be really common for this to shorten over time as well. Okay. And I want to point out too that every stage of this cycle of violence, there's abuse happening. There's abuse happening in the honeymoon phase or in the manipulative kindness phase, because he's manipulating her to stay by keeping, or by saying empty promises, by maybe he's minimizing, denying, or blaming the abusive behaviors on her. You might say, I'm so sorry, but you know I don't like it when you do that. Or I'm so sorry, but you know I'm under a lot of stress right now. I'm so sorry, but there's always an I'm so sorry, but where he's blaming the abusive behavior on something else. And then that tension building phase, that's their favorite place to keep an abusive person, or an abusive person's favorite place to keep their partner is in that tension building, because it is like walking on eggshells. They never know what's going to happen next. And so that abusive person has power and control because they're keeping that other person on their toes, and they get to decide what happens next. Okay. So want to go over, why does she stay? So if you can, after everything we've gone through today, why do you think she stays? Any ideas? Fear of retaliation, fear of the kids. Yep. Financial abuse. Yep. Cycle of violence, financial reasons, fear of being alone. Yep. Those are great answers, and all included in why does she stay. There are a million reasons why she might stay. And one of the biggest reasons might be that love. I'll show a little slide later, but that love, maybe he is a Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality. Maybe he can be really charming. He can be really loving. That's exactly how he was at the beginning of the relationship. And so you stay in the relationship even when he's exhibiting those abusive behaviors because you want that guy. You want that loving person. You've seen it before, and you care about them. Financial abuse, a few of y'all said that, is huge. Maybe she doesn't have any resources. Maybe because of that isolation that he's used, he has cut off her support system from her family or her friends, or maybe he has control of all the money, so she doesn't have any money that she can use to get a new place to live. I saw one of y'all say fear. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. Fear. So yeah, fear that he's going to escalate, fear of threats, continued abuse, of being murdered, and that fear is justified. The time that abuse is most likely to escalate is within the first 48 hours of a woman leaving. So it can be a really dangerous time for a woman. It can be really scary when she is finally leaving that abusive relationship. I had a client who husband used to tell her exactly how he was going to kill her. He would tell her where he was going to bury her body, the steps that he would take, how he would keep it from anyone finding out what was going to happen. If he did get caught, how long he would be in jail, what was going to happen to the kids. So she was terrified. He had planned out every single step of how he would kill her, and she was scared, rightfully so. There's that low self-esteem, that diminishment of her that he's used over and over time. She doesn't have the confidence to leave. Kids is a huge one, because that is the number one reason that women will stay, is for the children. Immigration status. Maybe he's threatening to call the deportation people if she leaves him, and he's going to threatened to have her deported. And so she might stay in the relationship for that. Or maybe he brought her over from the United States and he feels like he has the power, and she has that fear, that what is she going to do if she leaves him? Religious convictions or personal beliefs, pressure from friends or friends, family or friends, and then again, that lack of resources or finances. So there's a lot of reasons why she stays. But one of our favorite questions, and a better question than why does she stay, is, oh, it went back, is why does he do that? And I think that is an important question that we need to be asking. Why does he do that? And so in the chat, can y'all tell me some reasons you think that he might be abusive? Family history. mental illness. He has low self-esteem, learned behavior, mental illness. Yeah. So feeling superior. So I kind of set y'all up to fail. So I want to talk about some myths about domestic violence. So all of the reasons that you posted or that y'all sent into the chat are really common beliefs that we have, that society has about why a man is abusive. Some of those myths are mental health. Some of those myths are low self-esteem, that his dad was abusive with his mother, drugs and alcohol. But what we're looking at here, drugs and alcohol, mental health, anger management, they're all their own issue in themselves, specifically drugs and alcohol and mental health. So research actually shows that the majority of people who have that, the majority of abusers do not have a mental health issue or concern. Mental health and drugs and alcohol can escalate the abusive behavior. So hear me say that if there is drug and alcohol or a mental health issue involved, then it can escalate it, but it is not the cause of the abusive behavior. These are two issues in themselves. Just like getting sober is not going to cure. So getting sober is not going to cure abusive behavior. Getting sober will cure their drug and alcohol addiction, but it will not cure the abusive behavior. So that is something that needs to be treated on their own. For anger management, I think it's important to note that most of our clients who report their abusive partner being really angry know exactly when it is okay for them to be angry. I might argue that abusive men or abusive people have the best anger management out of anyone, because they know exactly when it is appropriate for them to express that anger. They know it's not appropriate to express that anger at work or around friends or family, or around in their faith community or in their other community support, but they can know how to reserve that anger specifically for her at home. And whenever he is angry and breaking things and smashing things, he always knows whose stuff he's breaking. So I had a woman who came to me and she was talking about how her abusive partner just trashed her house and destroyed her clothes, destroyed the plates that her mom had given her. And when she thought about it, she's like, he broke every single one of my things and none of his stuff was trashed at all. His dad was abusive with his mother. And so having one of y'all said those family relationships. But if they have experienced that and witnessed that, they know what it's like to experience abuse. And so that usually can be an indicator that I don't want to do that when I get older. Low self-esteem. So if he has low self-esteem, that can actually be a manipulation tactic, because if he has low self-esteem, what is his partner constantly doing? She's constantly stroking his ego and saying, you're so great. Like, I don't know why you think that about yourself, or I wish you could see yourself the way that I do. And she's constantly trying to cater to him and trying to make him feel better. So that can be a manipulation tactic that he uses. Stress, we all experience stress. Stress is a very common emotion, and we're not abusive. So if it's not an excuse for us, if it's not an excuse for the woman, then it shouldn't be an excuse for him either. And she deserved it. And no, we know that no one deserves to experience abuse. But why does he really do that? And I mentioned this a couple of times, but power and control. And so that was in that first definition that we had, but that is, he wants power and control. And why wouldn't he be abusive when he's getting what he wants, whenever he's getting all of his needs met, whenever the world revolves around him? He's getting a lot of benefits. Exactly, he's getting what he wants. And so he uses this behavior because he sees that he can manipulate the world to and get all of his needs met. Sorry, I'm kind of rushing through because I want to make sure we have time for questions. but this image of Dr. Huxtable and Mr. Hyde. And so just kind of what I was going back to that Jekyll and Hyde personality. Abusive men, I think that can be a common misconception too, is that we think they are monsters, and we might think that they look like monsters out in the world, but really what they look like is someone who's charming, someone who's funny, someone who gets along well with others. But really, reality, they're someone who is using power and control tactics. They're someone who to get what they want. And so they don't actually look like that, but they're presenting themselves one way. So 5 ways to help a friend. Believe her. I'm so glad you feel comfortable talking to me about this. What is happening in your relationship is not okay, and I want to support you as best as I can. Don't blame her. This is not your fault. Everyone deserves to be in a safe relationship. So I think this is important because we so often can be victim blaming. Maybe the woman does drink. Maybe the woman is really standoffish and she's been kind of rude to us in the past. And so people are gossiping and they say, well, she doesn't drink a lot. Or, well, she's never been very friendly. I can't imagine like living with that. And when we're saying comments like that, we're actually victim blaming. And she's probably acting that way or drinking or using drugs because she's trying to cope with whatever is going on at home. Yes, they're unhealthy coping mechanisms, but that's the way that she's trying to get through this, right? Trying to survive right now. Help her begin to think about safety planning. Let's talk about how I can help you. Who are other people you trust that you can talk to about this? When are times you feel most vulnerable or unsafe? Refer her to Genesis. We are here. There are people who can help you. Have you heard of Genesis? You can call their 24 hotline anytime at 214-946-HELP for support. Continue to provide support. This must feel really scary and overwhelming, and I want you to know that I'm here for you through this process no matter what happens. So Genesis services. We provide a 24 hotline, emergency shelter, transitional housing, outreach center, individual and group counseling, trauma recovery, play therapy, teen counseling, on-site school advocacy, parenting classes, and legal services. So know that these resources are available. If you know someone, if you have a client who has experienced any form of abuse, if they've experienced verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, spiritual, know we're here, that we're here to provide support and resources to them. And last, thank you. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you all for your support and participation.